In the long haunted corridors of Britain's monarchy, many kings have died with dignity, some with honor, others with tragedy, but none left the world in such grotesque decay as King George IV. His life was a slow-motion collapse, a carnival of excess and shame that ended not with majesty but with rot. To understand his monstrous end, we must begin at the glittering surface of his youth, when he was not yet a beast, but a prince of promise. George Augustus Frederick was born in 1762, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. From the moment of his birth, he carried the weight of expectation. The heir to the throne of Britain was destined for greatness, or so the nation believed. As a boy, George dazzled those around him. He was witty, intelligent, handsome, and full of charm. His tutors praised his quick mind, his effortless memory, his gift for languages. He could speak French, Italian, and German, and he played the violin and piano with grace. In his early portraits, he seemed every inch the future monarch bright-eyed, elegant, poised for a brilliant reign, but beneath this surface was a restless hunger. The boy who smiled in portraits was already restless in his gilded cage. He longed for pleasure, for indulgence, for escape from the rigid world of his father. King George III was strict, frugal, moral, to the point of severity. His son, however, craved everything his father denied himself by his teenage years. George was sneaking wine into his chambers, chasing women through hidden corridors, and mocking the sober world of his father's court, where the king valued restraint. The Prince of Wales embraced indulgence, and the world noticed the first gentleman of England by his 20s. George had transformed himself into a figure of celebrity. Known as the first gentleman of England, he dazzled society with his wit, his fashion, his extravagant taste. Carlton House, his London residence, became the epicenter of pleasure in the kingdom. Here, night after night, George hosted feasts that stretched into dawn. Mountains of food arrived in endless procession. Beef, lamb, venison, exotic fruits, pastries dripping with sugar, oceans of champagne and claret. Musicians played, dancers whirled, courtesans laughed, and the prince consumed it, all food, drink, and pleasure alike. He was the embodiment of excess. His tailors struggled to keep pace with his demands. He owned hundreds of waistcoats, dozens of elaborate uniforms, and jewels worth a fortune. His debts spiraled into the tens of thousands, then the hundreds of thousands, until Parliament itself had to intervene again and again, bailing out the prince to protect the dignity of the monarchy. But each bailout only fueled him further. George was not a man chastened by consequence. He was a man emboldened by indulgence. The more he was saved, the more recklessly he lived. The secret marriage in 1785. At just 23, George committed an act that shocked the royal establishment. He secretly married a Roman Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert. The marriage was illegal under English law, forbidden by the Royal Marriages Act and by religion itself. Yet George pursued it recklessly, driven by lust and impulse. For years, Maria was the shadow queen of his life, the woman he claimed to adore even as he betrayed her with countless mistresses. Their union was both passionate and poisonous. A scandal whispered in every drawing room of London, but it was not his only marriage scandal. When political necessity demanded he wed a Protestant princess, George agreed grudgingly to marry Caroline of Brunswick. Their wedding was a catastrophe from the start. George arrived drunk, disgusted by his bride, and collapsed unconscious in the fireplace before the night was over. From then on, husband and wife waged a war of hatred, their mutual contempt spilling into public view. Caroline mocked his obesity and indulgence. George mocked her manners and appearance. They separated almost immediately, and their battles filled newspapers across Europe. When she attempted to attend his coronation years later, George bared her from the doors of Westminster Abbey, humiliating her before the entire nation. She died soon after, and many whispered it was heartbreak and humiliation that killed her. The decline of the body by his 30s, George's once handsome figure was already fading. His appetite was monstrous. Breakfast alone might include pigeons, steaks, kidneys, eggs, piles of buttered bread, and oceans of wine and brandy. This was not indulgence, it was gluttony of the highest order. His body swelled. His once face puffed into a pale, bloated mask. His waist expanded until no ordinary garments would fit him, and yet he remained obsessed with appearance. He forced himself into corsets so tight that he could barely breathe. He powdered his hair and painted his face to conceal blemishes. He dressed in glittering uniforms, medals jangling, attempting to project the image of nobility, even as his body betrayed him. Servants whispered of his double chins, his heaving belly, his labored breath. Courtiers snickered behind his back, calling him the Prince of Wales. And still, he ate, he drank, he consumed. Pleasure was his master, and he its most devoted servant. The Prince Regent when King George III sank into madness in 1811. The nation turned to the Prince of Wales as regent. At last, George wielded true power. For a time, hope flickered that he might rise to the occasion, that the charm of his youth and the grandeur of his tastes might translate into wise leadership. At first, he seemed determined to prove himself. He sponsored great works of architecture, most famously the glittering pavilion at Brighton, with its domes and minarets and gilded halls. He patronized artists, musicians, and designers, turning Regency England into a period of elegance and style that still bears his name. But behind the glitter, the rot continued. His feasts grew even more lavish, his debts more ruinous, his indulgence more grotesque. Diplomats from abroad reported with shock the scenes they witnessed at Carlton House, mountains of meat devoured, oceans of wine consumed, the prince stumbling, half-conscious through his halls, bloated and sweating, yet demanding more. A mask of grandeur. George's coronation as king in 1820 revealed the truth. The mask of grandeur could no longer hide the reality of decay. The ceremony was the most expensive in British history, dripping with jewels, gold, and silk. Yet the man at its center was no longer a gentleman, but a grotesque parody of royalty. Observers whispered that he resembled a swollen whale forced into robes. His face sagged, his eyes dull, his body swaddled in layer upon layer of fabric to disguise its shape. The people, who once adored the charming prince, now jeered and mocked their king. For the next decade, George reigned in name but lived in decay. His health collapsed. His legs swelled with dropsy, grotesque with fluid. His feet were so swollen that he could not wear normal shoes. His skin split with sores. His breath rattled with disease. Worse still, he could no longer lie down to sleep. The fat of his body crushed his lungs if he reclined, so he sat upright in a chair through the night, wheezing, groaning, praying for breath. Servants dreaded the hours of darkness, when the king's cries echoed through the halls. The horror of the court. By the late 1820s, George was almost blind from cataracts. His hands were twisted with gout, his movements slow and painful. Laudanum dulled his agony, but clouded his mind. His servants described him as incoherent, weeping one moment, raging the next. The stench of his body was unbearable. Windsor Castle reeked of his decay. Courtiers gagged as they approached his chambers. Doctors lied to him about his health, fearing his violent outbursts if told the truth. Mirrors were banished from his rooms. He could not bear to see the monster he rotting on the throne. The years dragged on, and with them the slow, grotesque collapse of King George IV. What had once been a body of charm and elegance was now a grotesque prison of flesh and pain. Every day became a struggle, every night a nightmare. And yet, he clung to life out of vanity, out of fear, out of sheer unwillingness to surrender to the darkness. A kingdom in shadow. By the mid-1820s, Britain had grown weary of its king. The people saw through the pageantry to the decay beneath. Newspapers mocked him. Caricatures exaggerated his swollen form, his double chins, his wheezing breath. The very man who once symbolized elegance now symbolized gluttony and corruption. His court, once a place of pleasure, had become a mausoleum of whispers and stench. Ministers came reluctantly, enduring the suffocating smell of rot that clung to his chambers. They bowed, they spoke, they endured, and they left with relief to breathe the fresh air outside. The king of the world's most powerful empire was reduced to a spectacle of pity and ridicule. Feasts of the dead even. As his health collapsed, George refused to abandon his monstrous appetites. He devoured food with the desperation of a man terrified of emptiness. Breakfasts included anchovies, pigeons, buttered bread, chocolate, coffee laced with brandy. Lunches were heavier: roasts, stews, mountains of potatoes and gravy. Dinners stretched into midnight, courses piled upon courses, desserts drowning in sugar, oceans of wine and brandy. Servants whispered that he ate like a condemned man, stuffing himself as if death were only one meal away. And perhaps it was. His belly swelled like a drum, his face blotched with red, his breath labored and foul. Yet still he demanded more. Bring me the pheasant, bring me the pie, bring me another bottle. Each order was a nail in his coffin, hammered by his own gluttony. The corset king. Yet, even as his body ballooned, George remained obsessed with appearance. He forced himself into corsets so tight that he fainted during fittings. His servants laced him into uniforms designed to disguise the grotesque bulk beneath. His boots were specially made to cover swollen ankles. His wigs and powdered hair concealed baldness and sores. His face was painted to cover the blotches of disease. To the public eye, he still tried to project the image of majesty, but those who saw him up close knew the truth. The king was a swollen parody of himself, a man desperate to hide the reality of decay. And the more he hid, the more grotesque the deception became. The torment of gout. By the late 1820s, George was tormented by gout. His feet and legs swelled until even the lightest touch brought screams of agony. Walking became impossible. Servants carried him in special chairs, lifting his bloated form from chamber to chamber. At night, his screams echoed through Windsor Castle. The pain was so severe that laudanum opium mixed with alcohol was poured down his throat in desperate attempts to calm him. For brief hours, the drug dulled his torment, but it clouded his mind. He rambled incoherently, wept like a child, and raged like a madman. He was not a king. He was a prisoner of his own diseased flesh. The chair of the dying king's leap became impossible. His lungs, crushed by the fat of his chest, refused to breathe if he lay flat. And so he slept sitting upright in a chair, gasping, wheezing, moaning through the night. His servants dreaded the darkness, for the halls of Windsor rang with his groans. Sometimes they heard him praying, begging God for relief. Other times he cursed, demanding more food, more wine, more laudanum. His life had become a grotesque theater, a king rotting alive before the eyes of his nation. The stench of decay. By 1829, the stench of his body filled the castle. His skin oozed sores, his legs leaked fluid, his breath was sour and foul. Visitors covered their noses, ministers hurried their audiences, servants fought nausea as they approached. Mirrors were banished from his chambers. He could not bear to see what he had become. The first gentleman of England was now too grotesque to face even his own reflection. A nation's disgust. The people of Britain, once dazzled by his charm, now mocked their king openly. Caricatures showed him as a whale, a bloated pig, a monster drowning in food and drink. Satirical papers described him as a corpse crowned in gold. His attempts at grandeur only fueled their contempt. He spent fortunes on jewels, palaces, feasts while his people struggled under poverty and unrest. He demanded to be adored, but received only jeers. His name, once whispered with admiration, now stank of ridicule. The death approaches by 1830. George's body was failing rapidly. His dropsy swelled, his legs grotesquely, his chest rattled with fluid, his heart strained with every beat. He was almost blind, almost deaf, nearly incoherent with pain and drugs. Doctors hovered like vultures, offering little more than opium and false assurances. The king, terrified of death, begged them for hope. They lied, telling him he would recover. He clung to these lies like a drowning man clings to driftwood, but the end was near. The King of England was no longer a monarch, no longer a man. He was a corpse waiting for the moment his heart would stop. The year was 1830, and the shadow of death had already settled over Windsor Castle. The king's chambers had become a sickroom of despair, filled with the stench of decay and the whispers of servants who knew the end was near. George IV, once the glittering first gentleman of Europe, was now a grotesque ruin of flesh and fear, clinging desperately to a life that had long since lost all dignity. The last night as June approached, the king's condition worsened. His legs, swollen with dropsy, were grotesque columns of fluid. The skin stretched and cracked, oozing a foul stench. His belly ballooned until breathing became a constant torment. At night, he sat in his chair, propped with pillows, gasping for air. His lips moved in frantic prayers, though no one knew if he sought God's mercy or begged simply for another hour of life. Servants dozed at his side, startled awake by his sudden groans. The sound of liquid in his lungs filled the chamber like the gurgling of a dying swamp. The King of England could no longer walk, could no longer eat without choking, could no longer even relieve himself with dignity. Buckets of foul fluid were carried from his chamber, the evidence of a body drowning in its own corruption. The doctor's deception, his physicians hovered constantly, prescribing laudanum, opium, bleeding, poultices, rituals that offered no relief. They spoke to him gently, promising recovery. Your Majesty will rally. The summer air will restore you. Soon you shall ride again. They lied. They all lied, for they knew the truth. The king was rotting alive, and there was no cure. But they feared his wrath, feared the scandal, feared the moment he realized that death was inevitable. George clung to their false promises like a terrified child. I will live, he muttered between gasps. I must live. I am the king. England cannot do without me. But England could, and England already had. The horror of his body by mid-June. His condition became monstrous. His eyes, once bright and calculating, were glazed and bloodshot. His teeth rotted in his mouth, his tongue swollen, his breath a cloud of decay. His body leaked fluids that stained his sheets. His very skin a map of sores and eruptions. Servants whispered that the smell reached the corridors. Ministers dreaded entering his chamber, for the air was foul, heavy with the stench of death before death. The once proud king was now a grotesque spectacle, half alive, half corpse. The final day. On the morning of June 26, 1830, George IV's strength failed. He sat upright in his chair, eyes wide with terror, gasping like a drowning man. His hands clutched at the air, as though fighting invisible demons. His lips formed words, pleas, curses, prayers, but the sounds were only gurgles and moans. The physicians rushed forward, forcing laudanum between his lips. He choked, coughed, spewed the foul liquid back. His bloated chest heaved, his swollen belly rose and fell in grotesque rhythm. Then came the moment. His body convulsed, his face purpled, and a cry tore from his throat, a sound described by witnesses as not human but animal, the final roar of a beast being dragged into the abyss, and then silence. The King of England was dead. Aftermath. In the chamber, the silence was broken only by the ragged sobs of a few loyal servants, but most felt relief. Relief that the horror was over. Relief that they would no longer endure the nightly screams, the stench, the grotesque spectacle of their master's decline. The doctors, pale and shaken, exchanged glances. One whispered, "God, forgive us." For in truth, they had not healed their king. They had only prolonged his suffering. George IV's corpse was so swollen and foul that preparations for burial were hurried. Embalmers struggled, horrified by the condition of his body. They stitched, stuffed, and perfumed, but no amount of artifice could disguise the grotesque ruin. The king who once obsessed over appearances left this world as a monstrous figure. His vanity mocked even in death. The nation reacts. News of his death spread quickly, and unlike the mourning that had followed other monarchs, Britain responded with a mixture of indifference and contempt. The Times wrote simply, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." Crowds in London did not weep, they did not pray. They jeered, they mocked, they celebrated that the bloated tyrant was gone. Caricatures showed the devil welcoming George IV into hell. Pamphlets cursed his memory, calling him a glutton, a debauchee, a disgrace to the crown. England had not lost a king. England had been freed of a burden. The legacy of rot thus ended the life of George IV, a man who could have been remembered as a patron of the arts, a leader of refinement, the first gentleman of Europe. Instead, he was remembered as a monster of indulgence, a slave to gluttony and vanity, a king who rotted while still alive. His death was not a tragedy, it was a warning of what happens when power serves only pleasure, when vanity consumes honor. When a man crowns himself in gold but drowns in his own decay. In the history of monarchs, some die as heroes, some as villains, but George IV died as something worse, an object of disgust. His name would live on, not in glory, but in mockery. The king who ate himself to death. The king who lived in denial. The king who left behind a stench that neither time nor perfume could erase.